Montana Territory, September 1887. The wind carried the smell of pine and dust as Jackson Dale stepped down from his horse and looked up at the white clapboard church on the ridge its steeple weathered, its door still hanging slightly crooked like it had 16 years ago. He had not been back here since the day he left her standing inside, dressed in white, with her hands trembling and her eyes wide with something between hope and fear. That day had never left him, not for a minute. He pushed open the church door. It creaked like a memory, and there she was. Katherine Brooks stood near the altar, half turned as if she had just finished some quiet prayer. Her dress was plain, sleeves rolled a little from the work she had been doing tidying the pews, maybe. But her hair was the same golden brown, pinned up but loose in a way that made his chest tighten. She turned fully when she heard him, and her eyes filled before she could stop it, tears still in her eyes. "Jackson," she whispered. He took off his hat, holding it in both hands, unsure what to do with himself. "Katie." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. "Why are you here?" Her voice was steady, but her hands weren't. She held them together like if she let go, she might fall apart. "I heard about your father," he said. "I came to pay respects." She nodded once. Her father had passed 2 weeks ago. Katie had looked after him until the end, same as she had looked after everything else Jackson had left behind. The town, the church, her heart. "You could have written. I could have done a lot of things." She looked down, brushing her hand across the edge of the altar. "You left me here, Jackson, in this church, on our wedding day. I know. You did not come back. I know." The silence stretched again. Jackson looked older now, his jawline rough with sun and grit, a fine line near his brow that had not been there before, but his eyes. Those were still the same, blue and deep and full of regret. "I never stopped loving you," he said, voice low. Katie let out a breath like it hurt her. "You do not get to say that. You do not get to walk back in here and say that." He stepped closer, slow. "I did not plan on coming back. I thought I was doing you a kindness. You deserved better than a man who lived with his fists and rode for money." "I deserved honesty," she snapped. "I was scared." She looked at him for a long time, then turned away. "You were not the only one." The church door opened behind them, and a little voice called out. Mama, a girl of about 8, stepped inside, holding a bucket of water with both hands. Her light brown hair was braided neatly down her back, face flushed from the sun. She paused when she saw Jackson. Jackson's breath caught. "Katie." Katie turned toward the girl. "Clara, put that down by the basin." Clara did as told, then looked up at him again. "Mama, who is this man?" Katie hesitated. "He is an old friend." Jackson did not move. His chest felt like a horse had kicked it. "She's mine." Katie looked at him, her jaw working. "Yes." He took a step back like the truth had struck him across the face. "You never told me. You never came back." Katie walked to Clara and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Go on and help Mrs. Madsen with the candles." Clara looked between them, then nodded and slipped back out the side door. Jackson sat down on a pew like his legs would not hold him. "I had a daughter." Katie stayed standing. "You had a choice and you made it. I was 22 and full of fear. I thought I was no good for you." She crossed her arms. "And now, I still think I do not deserve you, but I am here and I want to try." Katie's mouth trembled, but she held firm. "You do not get to just try because it is convenient now." He looked up at her raw, open. "I am not asking for easy. I am asking for a chance to be her father, to be whatever you will let me be." Katie walked past him, her fingers brushing the edge of a pew. "You say you came for my father's funeral, but you came here first. I had to see you. I could not stand another night wondering what I gave up." She stopped at the front of the church again, facing the altar. "It is not that simple." "I do not expect it to be." He stood. "Let me stay a while. Let me help." She turned to him, tears still clinging to her lashes. "Why now?" "Because I finally became the man I should have been back then, and I want to know my daughter. I want to make peace, and maybe find a way back to you." Katie stared at him for a long moment, then she nodded once. "Start by helping me carry the hymnals from the back." He blinked, the shift so sudden it nearly knocked the air out of him. "All right." He followed her down the aisle, and for the first time in 16 years, the church did not feel like a graveyard of mistakes. It felt like maybe, just maybe, it could be the beginning of something new. And Jackson Dale had no intention of walking away again. The hymnals were stacked in the back room, tucked beside a cracked window that let in a long wedge of late-day sun. Dust floated in the air between them as Jackson lifted a bundle and handed it to Katie. Their fingers brushed, but neither of them pulled away too fast. She carried hers out without a word. He followed. The pews were worn smooth by years of sitting, praying, waiting. They worked side by side, setting a hymnal at each seat. The silence between them was different now, not brittle like before, just quiet. Like the hush of a storm already past, Jackson adjusted one of the books and glanced toward her. "You still play the organ," Katie nodded without looking up. "Every Sunday." He ran his fingers along the back of a pew. "That little one, the girl Clara, she know who I am?" "No." Katie's voice held no sharp edge, only steadiness. "She knows her father left before she was born, that's all I ever said." He nodded and set the last hymnal down. "She looks like you. She has your hands." Katie straightened, brushing her skirt smooth, long fingers, always in motion. Jackson's mouth tugged in something almost like a smile, but it faded quick. "I'd like to meet her proper. Not just as some stranger." Katie walked to the front and sat down on the first pew, back straight. "She's cautious with new folks, always has been. She asks questions I don't always have answers for." He took a seat beside her, though not too close. "I don't want to confuse her. But I want to be honest." Katie watched the light shift through the stained glass, the colors sliding across the floor. "She's been asking about school in Helena, says she wants to read law books." Jackson's brows lifted. "Law?" She asked once if a girl could be a judge. "When I said yes, she said she'd be better than all the men because she listens better." He chuckled soft, surprised. "Sounds like she's got her mother's backbone." Katie looked at him then, full on. "She's had to learn it early," he nodded, and the quiet held. After a moment, Katie stood and walked to the vestibule, lifting a small wooden box from the shelf. She opened it and took out a folded piece of cloth. "Your mother made this quilt top before she passed. I finished it last winter. Thought Clara might like it, but she said it smelled like the attic." Jackson stepped closer, taking the bundle gently. He ran a hand across the stitching, careful not to miss a square. "She always said she'd finish this one. She was waiting for you to come home." He held the quilt to his chest a moment, then folded it again. "Thank you for keeping it." Katie's hands dropped to her sides. "You were the first man I ever kissed. I thought that meant something to you." "It did." He looked at her, gaze steady. "It still does." Outside, the wind picked up, shaking the dry leaves from the elm near the steps. The shadows inside the church had grown long. Katie reached for her shawl from the coat hook, wrapping it tight around her shoulders. "There's supper at Mrs. Madson's tonight. She cooks for whoever shows up. Mostly widows and the old hands from the mill road. Clara helps serve." Jackson stepped back, giving her space. "Would it be all right if I came too?" Katie met his eyes, her voice quiet but firm. "If Clara says yes, then yes." He nodded, tucking the quilt under his arm. "I'll wait out front. Let her ask." As Katie moved past him, something in her shifted just a little. Not forgiveness, not yet. But maybe the first sliver of trust. He stood alone in the vestibule after she left, the scent of pine wood and old pages thick around him. He had not earned anything yet, but he was here. Not as a ghost this time. As the last bit of light slipped through the high window, Jackson stepped outside, quilt in hand, and waited on the steps. The sun had dipped below the ridge by the time Clara came out from the side of the church, her apron slightly damp and her braids loosened at the ends. She paused on the steps when she saw Jackson waiting there, quilt folded neat across his lap. Katie followed just behind, arms full with a small basket of bread wrapped in a cloth. She looked between the two of them, then crouched beside her daughter. "You remember how I said the man inside was someone I once knew?" Clara nodded, eyes cautious. "Well, he's asked to come to supper tonight, but I told him it was your say." Clara looked up at Jackson, studying him like she was sizing up a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit yet. "You ride horses," he stood slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Yes, ma'am, raised colts and worked cattle in Wyoming. Broke my arm once on a wild bay that didn't want to be broke." Clara tilted her head. "Did you cry?" "No," he said. "But I cursed loud enough the prairie dogs ran for cover." She grinned, just a little, then looked at her mother. "He can come." Katie gave Clara's shoulder a light squeeze, then nodded toward the road. "Mrs. Madson's waits for no one, not even long-lost cowboys." They walked together down the slope, the sky gone lavender and the grass whispering underfoot. Jackson stayed a pace behind close enough to hear Clara's chatter, but far enough to let Katie lead. He watched the way the girl gestured when she spoke, fingers dancing like she was painting her thoughts mid-air. Mrs. Madson's house stood near the edge of town, a square white structure with a sloping porch and a garden that had already gone to seed. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stew and wood smoke. A few older women sat at the long table, their bonnets hung on pegs, their eyes lifting when the trio stepped in. Katie greeted them by name, setting the bread down near the hearth. Clara slipped off her shoes and bustled to help set spoons at each place. Jackson removed his hat and stood near the door until Mrs. Madsen waved him in with a flour-covered hand. "You're the Dale boy," she said, squinting. "I remember you. Always had a bruise or a scab on your chin." "I reckon I was a rough sort," he said. "You still look it," she replied, but her tone was warm. The meal passed in fits of quiet conversation, the clink of ladles and the rustle of skirts. Jackson kept to simple questions, asking Clara about the book she was reading, letting her talk while he listened. Katie said little, but he caught her watching him when she thought he wouldn't notice. After the bowls were cleared and the fire burned low, Katie stood and tied her shawl again. "We ought to see Clara to bed," Mrs. Madsen nodded. "You take the lamp from the table, it's dark out." "You staying nearby?" Clara asked Jackson, wrapping her arms around her mother's waist. "I've got a bedroll at the livery for now," he said. "I'll find work soon." Katie met his eyes. "There's a room above the feed store. Mr. Loring rents it to travelers. I'll ask him in the morning." Clara yawned and leaned into her mother's side. Katie adjusted the girl's shawl and nodded toward the door. Jackson opened it for them, the night air sharp now, stars pushing through the sky. They walked back the way they'd come, the lamp casting a golden circle around their steps. At the church, Katie paused. "You want to see where she sleeps?" she asked. Jackson looked between her and the small figure at her side. "I'd be grateful." Inside the parsonage, the girl's room was small but tidy, with a single bed, a shelf of books, and a windowsill crowded with pressed flowers and river stones. Clara crawled under the quilt without protest, her thumb brushing the edge of the pillowcase. Katie leaned down and kissed her temple. "Say your prayers." Clara shut her eyes and whispered, and Jackson stepped back into the doorway, not wanting to intrude. "She likes having someone listen," Katie said after they'd stepped out into the hallway again. "I always will." Katie walked him to the porch. The wind had picked up, bringing the scent of rain from the mountains. "She's not a secret anymore," she said. He shook his head. "I don't want to be just a ghost in her story." Katie studied him a long moment. "Then don't vanish again." "I won't." The words didn't come easy, but they rang true. She nodded once, then turned back inside. The door closed with a soft click. Jackson sat down on the steps, the quilt still folded beside him. The church bell above creaked in the breeze, and somewhere inside, Clara's voice floated through a crack in the window, humming a tune he didn't recognize. He stayed there until the lamplight faded. The next morning, Jackson stood outside the feed store as the first light touched the tops of the cottonwoods. He hadn't slept much, just enough to feel the ache in his back from the bedroll and the weight of what came next. The store hadn't opened yet, so he took a seat on the stoop, rubbing the grit from his eyes and listening to the town shake itself awake. A wagon clattered past with sacks of barley tied down under canvas. A boy ran behind it, laughing, chasing a stray chicken that had gotten too bold. When the door finally creaked open, Mr. Loring didn't ask questions, just handed him a key and said, "It's a cot and a stove. Don't light the fire too high, chimney flues cracked." Jackson thanked him, climbed the narrow stairs, and found the room just as it was described. A single window faced west, its glass rippled with age. He set his things down and washed his face in the basin, then went back out before he could talk himself into staying holed up. He found Katie near the well behind the parsonage, sleeves damp to the elbows and her hair pinned tighter than the day before. She was scrubbing clothes against the washboard, hands red from the cold water. Clara sat nearby with a slate across her knees, her mouth moving silently as she copied rows of words. Jackson kept his distance until Katie looked up. She didn't smile, but she didn't turn him away either. "You got somewhere to be?" she asked, her voice even. "I was hoping to ask if the church roof still leaks. I remember the north corner used to catch rain worse than the rest." Katie glanced toward the building, then back at him. "You offering to fix it, if you'll let me." She nodded once and turned back to her work. Clara didn't look up, but her pencil paused briefly at the sound of his voice. By midday, he was on the roof, hammer in hand. The shingles were brittle in places, and a few had slipped down the slant entirely. He worked slow, careful not to crack what could still be saved, stripping back only what was necessary. The sun warmed his back, and the smell of sap and old dust rose around him. He didn't notice Clara had climbed up the ladder until he heard her voice behind him. "You missed a nail," she said, pointing. He turned, startled. "That's not a place for feet that small. I'm not afraid of heights." She crouched beside him like she'd done it 100 times. "Mama says I'm like a cat. She know you're up here." She said I could watch, not climb. He handed her a nail. "Then best we fix it quick before we both get scolded." She grinned and held it steady while he tapped it in. When she looked up at him again, her face was serious. "Did you ever have a dog?" He nodded. "A mutt named Crow, black with one white paw, mean as anything to strangers, but he'd sleep curled against my ribs when it got cold." Clara's voice dropped. "Mama won't let me have one, says we don't have time to teach it manners." Maybe she's right. Or maybe you just haven't asked the right way yet. She considered that. "If you stayed longer, would you help teach it?" "If she says yes, I will." Clara looked down at the churchyard, then back at him. "You don't talk like most men here. How's that?" "You don't talk to fill space." He smiled just a little. "Some things don't need words." Katie's voice called up from below. "Clara Brooks." The girl scrambled down the ladder before Jackson could stop her. He followed more carefully, boots finding purchase one slow step at a time. Katie stood with her arms crossed, her face unreadable. "She was helping," he said. "I told her to stay on the ground. I'll make sure she listens next time." Katie looked at Clara, who stared at her boots. Inside. Now, the girl went without argument. Jackson waited, expecting a reprimand. Instead, Katie stepped closer. "She doesn't invite people in easy, not even the other children." "I didn't ask her to, I know." Her eyes met his. "That's why she did." He studied her face, the fine lines at the corners, the way the wind had chapped her skin. "I'll keep helping as long as you'll have me." Katie nodded slowly. "There's fencing that needs repair behind the schoolhouse. You want to stay, you'll need to earn your keep. I wouldn't want it any other way." She turned then, no farewell, no softness, but she didn't tell him to leave. That evening, after supper, Jackson sat on the stoop outside the feed storeroom. He rubbed linseed oil into his saddle, watching the lamplight flicker against the dark. In the distance, above the trees, the church bell didn't ring, but he heard the faint echo of Clara's humming, just a thread of sound catching on the wind. He closed his eyes and listened. By late October, frost clung to the porch rails each morning, and the pines behind the parsonage had dropped most of their needles. Jackson's hands had grown rougher from the fence work and firewood splitting, and he'd taken to rising before first light to haul water for the schoolhouse stove. No one asked him to. He figured if he was going to stay, it ought to mean something beyond words. He found Katie one afternoon in the back garden, her sleeves rolled and her cheeks flushed from turning soil. A canvas sack lay beside her, half filled with potatoes. She didn't look up when he stepped behind the gate. "I thought these wouldn't come in," she said. "Too dry in July, but they held on." He knelt beside her, brushing dirt from one of the small russets. "Sometimes things take root anyway." She sat back on her heels, breathing heavy from the work. "I've been thinking about the land behind the church. It's gone wild. Could be cleared for a proper garden if someone was willing. I'll start on it tomorrow." She shook her head slowly. "I didn't ask." He met her eyes. "I know." They worked in silence until the sack was full. Jackson lifted it with one arm and followed her across the yard. She stopped near the porch, brushing her palms on her skirt. "Clara's been asking about your family," she said. "I told her what I knew, but I figured you ought to speak for yourself." He looked down at his boots. "My father drank more than he worked. My mother tried to soften it, but there wasn't much left of her by the time she passed. I left because there was nothing worth staying for. Not then." Katie nodded once. "She asked if you had brothers, sisters." "None." She opened the door and held it for him. Inside, the warmth of the stove wrapped around them. Clara sat at the table, brow furrowed as she stitched a patch onto a worn apron. Her thread kept tangling. She didn't look up right away. Katie took the sack from him and carried it to the root cellar door. Jackson stepped closer to the table, his voice low. "You want help with that?" Clara set the needle down and rubbed her eyes. "The thread's stubborn." He pulled out the other chair. "Sometimes it helps to wet the end, keeps it steady." She watched as he demonstrated, her mouth slightly open. "Did your ma teach you that?" He nodded. "She taught me most everything good I ever learned." Clara's fingers were careful now, copying his movements. When the needle passed through clean, she grinned with quiet pride. Behind them, Katie returned, wiping her hands on a cloth. "You two look like you're plotting something." Clara held up the apron. "It's almost fixed." Katie rested a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "You'll be teaching me next." They shared supper with the windows steamed over and the wind knocking gently against the panes. After the dishes were cleaned, Jackson fetched his coat. Katie followed him to the porch. "You could stay," he turned. "Tonight, longer." He studied her face, the steady way she met his gaze. "I won't leave again. I know." They stood close, the cold rising between them. She reached for his hand, fingers warm despite the chill. "Come morning," she said. "There'll be more to do." The back fence is leaning, and the stove in the schoolroom smokes up if it isn't watched. "I'll see to both." Katie leaned in then, slow, sure, and kissed him with the kind of quiet certainty that didn't need explanation. When they pulled apart, her hand stayed resting against his chest. "I still love you," she whispered. He closed his eyes. "I never stopped." She let him in that night, not just into the house, but into the small, sacred rhythm of their days. He slept on the cot near the stove at first, waking early to make coffee and walk Clara to school before heading to the fields. She never asked for more, and he never rushed it. By the time the snow set in deep, and the church bells rang for Christmas morning, the town had stopped calling him a drifter. He was just Jackson, the man who helped mend roofs and kept a careful eye on the girl with the quick tongue and curious mind. The wedding was quiet, just 5 folks in the pews and Clara holding the bouquet. Katie wore a blue dress she'd sewn from store fabric, and Jackson wore his best shirt, collar starched stiff. They spoke their vows clear and without trembling. After, Clara ran ahead to the parsonage, hollering about pie. Katie laughed, full and easy, and Jackson took her hand as they walked behind her, the snow crunching beneath their boots. They built a life with slow steps and shared labor. Jackson never missed a supper, and Katie never let him forget the value of silence between words. Clara grew taller with each season, and her questions never stopped. When she finally asked if she could call him Pa, it was with a shrug and a smile, like she already had for months. They planted the back garden that spring. Potatoes, green beans, and a small row of sunflowers at Clara's insistence. The fence held strong, and the church roof never leaked again. And so they lived not in grandness or ease, but in the hard-earned peace of people who had come through sorrow and chosen every day to stay.